So kind of this section, I think, will really kind of talk about how we're starting to realize that poverty is impacting kind of critical neurobiology, including the hippocampus and the frontal lobe, these two regions that I highlighted a couple slides ago. So when I was a graduate student, no one had really studied this work. There was all this kind of suggestive evidence from preclinical models, but there wasn't very much kind of at a human level. There were folks who were even skeptical that we'd be able to see these kind of differences in human. So I set out as a kind of very eager graduate student in Madison, Wisconsin, and kind of just started to like think about and survey the brain and think about kind of what I was starting to learn as a basic cognitive neuroscientist and what was behaviorally relevant. I started to think about the problems that kids were having who were in kind of low SES and other adverse contexts, and the behavioral challenges they were sometimes kind of showing in fair number. And then I took all this kind of literature that I was reading about experience and how stress, enrichment might start to impact the brain, and kind of came upon this hippocampus and the frontal lobe and how they might be important. And so again, we can think about the kind of hippocampus, and just to kind of recap, how the hippocampus is kind of critical to kind of learning and memory. It's influenced by the environment. And so therefore, there's kind of this kind of clear and critical target. And that was the first kind of place I started on. Given all this work on kind of enrichment and all those cells that I showed were all in the hippocampus, I was like, oh, the hippocampus is really going to be where we're going to start to find differences. And my PhD advisors let me kind of try these ideas out. They seem well motivated. And so what we did is we had this kind of strong motivation. And as a graduate student, I learned the kind of basic methods of cognitive neuroscience and behavioral neuroscience and did a lot of MRIs with kids, which they surprisingly tolerate well, especially because I pay them quite handsomely. But then we would take these kind of structural pictures of the brain. And so this is what's called a T1 weighted image. It's the basic brain anatomy, your basic brain structure. And we literally just quantified, it's maybe hard to see, in kind of mustardy yellow here, the hippocampus, which is this medial temporal lobe structure that I've already been focusing on. So we measured the hippocampus, and then we just kind of tried to correlate it really simply with aspects of income. And so in the earliest iterations of this work, we drew from a pretty large data set that had about 320 kids. With MRI data, they varied in terms of age, what we controlled for that, and they varied in terms of income. On the horizontal axis, you'll see income. It's a kind of funny, it's a midpoint log transform scale that my economist friends colleagues tell me to use. And on the vertical axis is a kind of normalized measure of hippocampal volume. And kind of keeping, I think, with the data that we were seeing in rodents, we found smaller volumes in the hippocampus related to socioeconomic status. And so for kids, all the way on the left side of the graph, there aren't that many of them, but we'll kind of go into that in a second, we see kind of lower levels of volume. And I always think about the easy way that I think about volume and translating that is it's almost like a muscle. So the more kind of muscle you have, the more you may be actually to exert some function. And so you can think about having a smaller hippocampus may mean challenges or difficulties in kind of exerting learning processes or kind of drawing from memory in different regards. So this is interesting, but you can kind of see some of the data is all over the road. There's a lot of variability, and we'll come back to that in a second. So again, being a very eager graduate student, I kind of went and scanned some more kids and tried to get some more data. And then we kind of replicated the same exact effect. There's high and low SES kids on the horizontal axis, and then these is the left and the right hippocampus. You can look at left versus right. You can look at total. You see the same kind of patterns. But basically, with greater exposure to poverty or low SES, which I sometimes will use interchangeably in this talk, we see kind of smaller volumes. And then interestingly, this effect has now been replicated by, I think, 3 or 5 different groups. And I'll highlight one of those kind of interesting replications. So this is by a colleague named Joan Luby at the University of, actually right here in town at WashU, in the WashU Med School. And so she and her colleague Deanna Barch looked at the income to needs of families with 3 to 5-year-old children. And then they looked longitudinally, a couple years later, at the kids' brain volume, specifically the hippocampus. And so they actually find the same exact relationship that I've been reporting. But I wanted to kind of show you some other kind of interesting things that they kind of also noted along the way. So what they also found was they found this, again, they found the same association, lower income to need, lower income to needs was was related to lower volume. So you can basically think about families who don't have as much money, basically have their kids have smaller hippocampi. But then interestingly, there was an association with income to needs and stress exposure, as well as stress exposure and brain volume. So basically, this is starting to kind of suggest aspects of a mechanism. It's still very far away from a mechanism, but I think it starts to say, basically, with lower income to needs, basically living in greater poverty, you have greater levels of stress exposure, and then when you have greater levels of stress exposure, you have smaller hippocampal volumes. So there's this kind of this association with stress and income to needs as well as brain volume. And then there's also some interesting data on kind of caregiving and parenting. And so what they found is many times low SES families had kind of greater challenges with caregiving. Sometimes the parents were expressing lesser warmth. We're going to talk about stigma in a couple sections, so I think that's something to kind of put a pin in and what that means. But low SES families often had kind of lower levels of warmth in their kind of experimental assessments of parenting. And then they found that higher parental warmth actually related to higher volumes in the hippocampus. You could think lower warmth would also relate to lower volumes. So basically the idea that parenting might be this moderator or buffer. If you may be living in a low SES context, but have a particularly warm and supportive parent, that may kind of ameliorate or lessen the effects that socioeconomic status and exposure to poverty are kind of exerting on the brain. And when you actually control for these kind of caregiving and stress exposure differences, the association between SES in its broadest sense and hippocampal volume went away. So it starts to speak to, and this is, I think, one of the foci of my research program is trying to thinking about the lived experiences of poverty and going back to what is it actually like to be poor? What is it like to be in a low SES context? How difficult and hard it is? And think about the factors that are day-to-day influencing families, because I think we're still kind of missing that as neuroscientists. We're asking about broad aspects of behavior. We're asking about income in a yearly span. And I think this work is a place where we're starting to get a little closer to what's happening. I'm also a new parent. I have a 17-month-old, so I think about how hard it is to be a parent, and I have a lot of economic means. To recap this kind of hippocampus section, we find that there's smaller hippocampal volumes. We also kind of say, what's the behavioral relevance? So you see kind of lower SES is related to smaller hippocampal volumes. Smaller hippocampal volumes are also related in one of these same studies to behavioral problems. So the reports of kids kind of getting in trouble at school, maybe getting in fights, even in the kind of more extreme cases getting suspended, was related to having kind of smaller volumes in this brain region. And I think about this kind of potentially being involving kind of the hippocampus kind of role in learning and memory and contextualizing. Maybe you're doing things in one environment that work and make sense, but you shouldn't be doing those in another environment. Yes?
Do you see the same kind of emotional dysregulation with Alzheimer's and the decrease in hippocampus as that early onset Alzheimer's develops in full?
So there's a question about kind of Alzheimer's, and Alzheimer's we can think about is a kind of progressive dementia that is often characterized by hippocampal differences. So the one thing I will say, and this is where the research needs to go a little bit further and farther, is that the hippocampus is a really complex structure. It's actually really tiny, but it has like 10 different sub-regions. And it's also connected to the brain, connected to different parts of the brain. So Alzheimer's has a lot of different kind of brain-related differences. There's obviously kind of clear differences in memory, and that's kind of a pretty clear, I think, behavioral correlate. And there's some suggestion that differences in the hippocampus are related to memory in some work focused on low SES kids. There's some kind of behavioral parallels, but I'll be honest, I only know the work on Alzheimer's as kind of a vague consumer, so I won't speak too definitively about it. But there are some parallels in some of the behavioral problems in terms of potential memory issues as well as kind of potential challenges with emotion that might be kind of, common but very different phenomenologically across the two populations. So that's kind of, I think, at least speaks to behavioral relevance. And then this is kind of, I think, a big thing with research and science right now is kind of replication. And so this effect, I highlighted one replication, but it's been replicated by 3 or 4 different groups at this point. And so related, I think, to the last comment and question, I think about kind of differences in hippocampal structure kind of may relate to kind of variations in stress responding, memory, as well as types of learning. Folks may know about the HPA axis and cortisol, and the hippocampus is kind of a critical player in that kind of system and circuit. So, yes?
Is this like so again, it's like long-term stress for these children just related to the poverty? So is it like trauma, like traumatic events, or
So in this same exact study, we actually surveyed kids who had different kinds of adversities and traumatic experiences. We worked with kids who began life in institutional settings in Russia and Romania, as well as kids who had documented histories of physical abuse. And we saw the same reductions in the hippocampus across all those populations. And so it's basically kind of suggesting, and I think about the hippocampus is being impacted by stress. Lots of different kinds of stress kind of are targeting and hitting the hippocampus because it's potentially a more environmentally sensitive region. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so like if you have like a child who, so I'm just thinking like trauma-informed care, like
Yep.
teaching and stuff like that, like as you're dealing with these kids that do experience, because I do teach in an affluent area,
Yep.
but like some of them do experience very traumatic events. So is there like the kids who are in low SES who have long-term stress, what's the difference between that and like someone who faces traumatic events?
I think there's a lot to unpack in the question. So I think that from a brain perspective, we're looking pretty coarsely at things right now, but we do see some similarities across those populations. And to be honest, and I'll come to this in the kind of later sections of the talk, these effects are significant, quote unquote, from a statistical sense, but they're modest. And I actually think many of these effects are probably being driven by the adversities that kids living in low SES contexts are being exposed to. So it kind of kicked off the talk with like this idea of kids are being exposed to violence and other kinds of threats in their environment. And I think that is common or happens for some kids in poverty, but not all kids. And I think we are still kind of figuring out kind of what sections of the populace kind of are experiencing both of these things altogether. But I think that poverty is kind of a context that sometimes creates these traumatic yes, exactly. Many of the families I've worked with and folks that I talk to living in difficult circumstances, really report some incredibly difficult things. And we'll kind of talk about this because I think trauma can come in various different forms. So, yes.
Can you just clarify, because earlier you were talking about normal development as this pruning process,
Yep.
the smaller, the brain,
Yep.
this gray matter,
Yep.
specifically increasing and then decreasing, but in volume, but here you're speaking about the hippocampus, it's the smaller volume
Yep.
is a negative thing, whereas the smaller volume later in life is a normal development. Can you just clarify?
Sure. I'll actually get to this in a couple of slides that I think I have nice data to kind of speak to this. But I think of this as almost causing a blunting of that development. And so basically, when the kind of brain is maybe kind of growing and expanding, kids in low SES environments, maybe kind of their kind of trajectory might be a little bit lower. And so then they kind of have this kind of drop off, or this kind of, everyone is kind of going through this pruning process, but they're kind of, peak level, their plateau is a little bit kind of under kind of maybe their more affluent counterparts. And then, we kind of keep looking over time and you still just kind of have this gap. It's almost the equivalent of like thinking about kind of achievement gaps, when kids are starting school, often in different studies I've read kind of remain fairly constant. It's really that the starting achievement gaps there's a gap at kindergarten, and then these often things get kind of continue to be different. And so that would be my kind of place where it's a blunting, I think, early in development, or as this kind of brain is kind of increasing, and then it's that change over time. Does that get at things? So we're going to turn away from the hippocampus and talk about the prefrontal cortex. So you can think about the hippocampus as really kind of centrally involved with learning and memory and those kinds of pieces. But there's also this kind of prefrontal cortex that we kind of know is centrally involved with kind of executive functioning, planning, thinking about the consequences of different actions. And it also has a pretty protracted postnatal development. So the prefrontal cortex, portions of the prefrontal cortex are still developing up until about 25. Insurance companies actually got it kind of really right on the nose, because that you can't run a car without being prohibitively expensive until 25. It's literally your prefrontal cortex, the developmental trajectory is still kind of pretty ongoing up until the kind of the early 20s. So we can think about behavioral relevance, executive functioning might be particularly important, and then there's this protracted kind of window where the brain is still kind of growing and changing that might let experience kind of potentially have pernicious effects. So this work, I think actually kind of related to the last question, is longitudinal in nature. So there'll be multiple MRI scans that we collected from kids and adolescents. They have 3 MACs. but they have between 1 and 3. And we did some kind of special statistical modeling to kind of account for aspects of our missing data. And then we kind of did the same thing where we kind of looked at the broad volume of these regions, whether it was the prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe shown in kind of blue, or the hippocampus shown in yellow. And the effects are actually will basically be pretty similar, but I'll just highlight the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex for this portion. So this is work with colleagues at the UW-Madison. Most notably, Nicole Hare is one of my good colleagues. We're going to talk about kind of frontal lobe developmental trajectory. So first, just kind of illustrate, and I'll show you some data. On the horizontal axis is age, and on the vertical axis is volume. And here's kind of the normative developmental, or the developmental trajectory of particularly affluent children. And so these are kids that are from households that you can kind of do the math. It's like $80,000, $90,000. These are $2,005. So it's probably families that are making at least probably about $100,000 today. And they're shown in blue, and you see this kind of curvilinear kind of developmental trajectory with this increase early in development and then this kind of decrease kind of post-puberty. And speaking to the kind of last comment, we see this kind of drop off and change in individuals at or below the poverty line, or at or just below the poverty line, where their level of development is kind of, I think, hitting a plateau a little bit earlier and then kind of dropping off and kind of potentially even increasing as they go through. And we found pretty similar effects for the hippocampus also. And so we kind of have this longitudinal view of how the brain is being impacted by experience. And so you can say, okay, Dr. Hansen, this is great. You showed me some MRI scans, I get it. But what about kind of my classroom and kids finishing up, and give me some behavioral relevance. So kind of turning to behavioral relevance, and specifically kind of highlighting and thinking about executive functions. So you can think about executive functions as these kind of top-down control, delaying gratification, inhibiting prepotent responses, kind of thoughtful planning, even just kind of holding information in terms in a short-term scale. So executive functioning is really has been pretty closely connected to frontal lobe integrity. And so what we did in this study is we didn't have any measures of brain, but we had pretty beautiful measures of executive function, which we think of as a kind of behavioral correlate of the frontal lobe and a behavioral output of the frontal lobe. And so kind of keeping, I think, with a lot of the data I'm showing, this is work by a colleague, Dustin Albert, that we did in North Carolina. We see this kind of association between SES and executive functioning. We actually were not the first folks to find this, but with greater socioeconomic status, with more affluence, you see better kind of executive functioning in the aggregate. So kind of greater ability to plan, kind of maybe think about consequences, hold memory in mind, inhibit prepotent responses, things like that. But actually kind of getting into you guys in behavioral relevance, we then turn to data from the North Carolina Education Data Resource Center, I think I got that acronym correct, which allows us to have the state standardized test scores of students in North Carolina. And so this work was done in 6th grade, I believe, but we found that SES was related, perhaps not surprisingly, and kind of keeping with, I think, some of the patterns we've shown. It was related to state standardized test scores. In terms of, these are end of grade math, reading, and science too, but I think I'll only show reading and math. So here I'll show reading and math, and I'll also show connections with executive functioning. So executive functioning is on horizontal axis, math and reading EOG scores, higher scores are better, kind of as part of this kind of end of grade milestone, are on the vertical axis. And we find a pretty decent connection between executive functions, a composite of executive functioning, and your kind of math and reading EOG score. So whether you're likely to kind of actually kind of complete this kind of basic milestone and kind of be seen as proficient from a state standardized perspective. And then I didn't kind of have a good figure for this, but if we control for executive functioning, the SES state standardized testing association is significantly mediated, significantly lessened. It's partially explained by these variations in this frontal lobe circuitry that's all about kind of top-down control and regulation of behavior. So, yeah, yes?
The density between the reading and the math, it shows that there is less of that
Totally. I'm actually from the Learning Research and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and I've learned a lot about learning science. And one of the things that I think is incredibly interesting is there's a lot of just kind of basic cognitive and neural machinery related to the processing of quantities. So people in the kind of education neuroscience world talk a lot from a math space about this, what's called an approximate number system. And so the brain can actually do kind of base computations of just like greater, less, greater, less. And there's different parts of the brain, portions of what's called the parietal lobe, which is basically the top of the head kind of in the back, that are involved with that kind of computation. So there's basically, I think, this underlying skill of like, you can do these kind of quick computations, and that's, I think, a kind of building block for more complex aspects of math, and also there's a developmental story in there. But then I think these executive functions are more about, your pre-calc is getting tougher, and it's a little bit more complicated, and you kind of have to stay on task and inhibit, playing on Snapchat or something like that. And those are when executive functions really kind of come to bear. Or you're just, you're really struggling and in class and you have to pay attention. And so I think of your kind of math ability as kind of maybe a combination of those two things, the approximate number system that's kind of underlied by the parietal lobe, as well as this kind of prefrontal top-down computations. Okay, and so we'll kind of start to wrap up, I think, some of the kind of science stuff and actually kind of get a little bit more into kind of implications and stigma, because I think those are big pieces that I need to kind of get into before we wrap up. So we see low SES is related to kind of frontal lobe volumes. These differences are related to executive functioning. We also find differences in EF. We think that differences in EF may create kind of issues with attention or kind of short-term memory, inhibition, those kinds of things. And that kind of gives us, I think, the mechanistic story of what might be happening. So to kind of, I think, pause and have just another kind of interim summary, make sure we're all kind of on the same page. We can think about the brain being shaped by experience and developing a great deal postnatally. Lower SES, exposure to poverty, is kind of related to these variations in the hippocampus and the frontal lobe. Lower SES being related to lower volumes. And these regions seem, and we know, are kind of critical from a basic cognitive neuroscience perspective with kind of aspects of learning, memory, planning, executive functioning. And when we account for variations in executive functioning, we see kind of some lessened SES education outcome gaps.